Hi there, this is Jasmine Pigeon with my research presentation on Indigenous language loss and revitalization. So this presentation will cover prior knowledge and future implementations. So the what, when, who, where, why, and how. So what? What is it? What can we do about it? And what do we teach? What is Indigenous language loss and revitalization? Indigenous language loss refers to the concept that Indigenous languages are on a trajectory towards extinction, or that some have already become extinct and lost to time. Indigenous language revitalization refers to the concept that through many different efforts, endangered languages can be revived and revitalized or brought back to life. What can we do about it? First and foremost, we must educate ourselves on Indigenous issues that might appear throughout our lives and our teaching. As a teacher, it is important to remember that we must also remain learners who are ready and willing to continuously learn about Indigenous perspectives. Secondly, we must use our knowledge to teach our students about the importance of Indigenous knowledge. We must draw the connection that language is the foundation to all Indigenous knowing and that losing it must be undone now by us. So, what do we teach? This answer will look slightly different depending on who you are, but should include some basic aspects. As a teacher, you should be teaching from a place of authenticity and reconciliation. It is important to utilize relevant resources that are historically accurate. It is vital as teachers to find a way to connect these topics to our life when possible. Teach the vibrant cultures of Indigenous peoples. Teach the accurate historical account of colonization. Teach the languages every day. Teach the protocols and traditional knowledge, just to name a few. When? When did this happen, and when can we use this in our own class? When did Indigenous language loss happen? What about revitalization? Indigenous language loss has been a product of assimilation and colonization since after the time of first contact. Language loss was perpetuated when legislation such as the Indian Act took place throughout Canada. The Indian Act also enforced the horrific participation in the residential school system, which also heavily contributed to language loss for many Indigenous peoples. Revitalization is still a dream for Indigenous peoples in Canada, but has been highlighted as a vital step forward. Indigenous incorporation is a huge component of the BC curriculum, with the hopes of revitalization attached to it. When can we use this in our classrooms? We can use Indigenous traditional knowledge of all forms in our classrooms every day, in every subject, in an endless amount of ways. Specifically, we can revitalize languages by practicing them in our classrooms as often as possible and drawing from authentic resources and teachers. When possible, teachers should utilize local elders and resource peoples from communities for any topic they approach through their teaching. It is vital for all teachers in BC to include an Indigenous approach as part of their own pedagogy and teaching philosophy, and to draw from the First Peoples principles of learning. It is also important to remember to honor the students within your classrooms that might relate to these Indigenous principles as their own. Who? Who does this affect and who can teach about this? Who does this affect? Firstly, this affects everyone. Anyone can benefit from Indigenous language learning. Secondly, and more prominently, this will affect the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the Indigenous students in your classrooms. It cannot be told the numerous ways that past traumas may affect your students, and it is imperative to remember this as you approach teaching and introducing sensitive topics. Thirdly, if you are hearing this as a fellow Indigenous person, then this might be affecting you as well. It is important to be self-reflective when teaching subjects that may also affect you. Who can teach about this? Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples alike should be teaching about the issues that have happened historically to Indigenous peoples and the issues they face contemporarily. If you are teaching this from a non-Indigenous perspective, it is important to consider if you would like to feature an Indigenous guest into your teaching to speak from an authentic Indigenous perspective. Where? Where did this happen and where can we use this in our own classrooms? Where did this Indigenous language loss and revitalization happen? Indigenous languages have been lost in varying degrees all over North America. For the purpose of this presentation, only Canada has been targeted for information, highlighting BC when possible. Some Indigenous languages in Canada are thriving, while others are on the verge of being extinct forever. BC has a particularly diverse distribution of Indigenous languages, with nearly half of all Indigenous languages from Canada being found there. Unfortunately, revitalization of Indigenous languages has not been successful thus far, having only a 5% fluency rate throughout the province's Indigenous population. Where can we use this in our classroom? We can use information and knowledge about Indigenous language loss and revitalization in a variety of ways. To teach the languages in our classroom to prevent them from becoming extinct, by reaching out and utilizing community elders and members in our classrooms for an authentic perspective, to teach our students an accurate depiction of history for Indigenous peoples, linking language loss to colonization, the Indian Act, and the residential school system, and by making Indigenous perspectives a part of our teaching pedagogy, drawing strength from the First Peoples principles of learning. Why? Why did this happen? Why does this matter to us as teachers? And why should our students learn about this? Why did this happen? The Canadian Encyclopedia eloquently highlights some of the reasons for Indigenous language loss in their 2020 article titled Indigenous Language Revitalization in Canada, when they state, "Many Indigenous languages in Canada are endangered because of a history of restrictive colonial policies that prohibited the speaking of these mother tongues. In an attempt to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian society, the Indian Act and residential schools forced Indigenous peoples to abandon their native languages. Residential school students caught speaking these languages were punished. Even after these schools were shut down, the loss of language knowledge and the fear of speaking Indigenous languages lingered, and therefore inhibited the passing of these languages from one generation to the next." Why does this matter to us as teachers? For Indigenous peoples throughout Canada, language is the foundation to culture and traditional ways of knowing. Language loss has led to the devastating loss of identity for many Indigenous peoples. The impact from the Indian Act and the residential school system will undoubtedly appear throughout your teaching career. This makes it so important to understand before you step in your classroom. It will give you the ability to be empathetic, knowledgeable, and prepared for the accompanying challenges. It is also important as future educators to be aware of some, if not all, of the calls to action presented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The calls to action address areas surrounding education, culture, and language that might be beneficial to you as a future educator. Why should our students learn about this? It is vital for our students to learn about Indigenous language loss and revitalization for a number of reasons, some of which are: it is a part of our shared history as Canadians. This might be the real and lived history for your Indigenous students, and the consequences of that might be present in your classrooms today. Language learning is an integral part of ensuring that languages don't become extinct but are indeed revitalized. Language learning is fun for everyone and is great for developing brains. They can become global citizens who are empathetic, understanding, and diverse within themselves. How? How did this happen? How did it end? And how can we make it right? How did this happen? Indigenous language loss grew as a consequence of colonization and later as an effect of legislation such as the Indian Act. Indigenous language loss was also a target of the residential school system, as was demonstrated by the many assimilative behaviors of the system. This language loss has been steadily advancing for many years in Canada and must be radically altered to break the cycle and allow for revitalization to continue, or in some cases begin. So, how did it end? Simply put, it hasn't ended yet. Although Canada has made amendments to the Indian Act and has taken numerous steps towards the preservation and revitalization of Indigenous languages, it is important as teachers to ensure that we do our part to prevent the extinction of our Indigenous languages. By taking the steps outlined in this presentation and taking certain care to include Indigenous language revitalization as a part of your teachings, we can help end the loss of languages throughout Canada. How can we make it right? As teachers, we can make things better by teaching our students age-appropriate material. We should use materials and resources that honor the lands that we live on. We should invite Indigenous peoples to share their own experiences where possible. We must always acknowledge the past accurately and relevantly. We can make it right by adapting our own worldviews and teaching pedagogy to include an Indigenous perspective. We must utilize the First Peoples principles of learning throughout our teachings. We can do our part to prevent the further extinction of Indigenous language loss through revitalization. So here I have included some ideas and resources for teaching. Teaching resources, there's some links for you. I found 3. And these are the websites that I used for help when I was researching for my presentation. So, Iri Skukstechum, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for coming. Bye.